Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Christopher Chope MP.
Well, Barry, you're too kind, but it's a great pleasure to be with the Bruges Group again. And I thought at one stage that the issues which got the Bruges Group going were solved, but far from it. And the fact that there are so many people here today shows that these are issues which we have to tackle, I think, in perpetuity. And to listen to Peter Lilly just now, isn't it a pity that same clarity of thinking and knowledge and understanding of basic economics doesn't seem to be shared by many people, frankly, in the government today. I was going to start talking about the problems of the rise of the administrative state and its threat to democracy. In other words, who's in charge? This was most vividly expressed to me when I was a junior minister in the Department of the Environment and Nick Ridley was the Secretary of State. In those days, the Department of the Environment, the ministerial floor was on the 16th floor in the in the centre tower in Marsham Street. And there was a memorable day when Nick Ridley got into the lift in order to travel to the 16th floor. And there was a sign up in the lift saying, "No smoking in this lift." And as some of you will recall, Nick was a chain smoker. He was in charge of the department. And he said in a stage whisper in the lift, he said, "Can somebody remind me who's in charge of this department?" And obviously that notice was then taken down, and he then found that one of his junior ministers had been persuaded by officials to campaign behind his back and the back of Margaret Thatcher and try and limit tobacco's sponsorship of sport. Well, how did he find out about that? Well, Dennis Thatcher found out about it, spoke to Margaret, and so when Nick went round and had a whiskey in Downing Street, he was confronted with this information that apparently his department was undermining the tobacco sponsorship of sport. And I'm afraid that was the end of my fellow junior minister in the department, because Nick was in charge and that minister had failed to recognise that, as indeed had the senior civil servants who had put up that notice in the lift. And as Peter mentioned, 2016, the Brexit referendum was all about the people taking back control. And what has happened, unfortunately, is that the people's representatives in Parliament have ceded control rather than taking it back. And we saw it written in spades during the COVID pandemic. But we can also see it in other aspects. So there should be, in this country, a separation of powers. And basically the power from the people should come to and be exercised in the elected parliament. The elected parliament makes the laws. The laws are then administered by the administrative branch in the separation of powers, and those laws are interpreted and enforced by the judicial branch. What has happened in recent years is that the power of Parliament has been eroded, and the other two branches have become more powerful at the expense of Parliament. And I'm going to give you some examples of this. One is that the House of Commons has given up control over setting the pay and conditions of members of Parliament. It so happens, Pete may remember this, in 1983 I made my maiden speech in Parliament on why MPs should not receive a pay rise and should set an example. And obviously I endear myself to Margaret Thatcher at that early stage in my political career. But in those days, MPs were in charge of their pay and conditions, and quite rightly so. In the end, that was given over to an unelected quango called IPSA. More recently, the House of Commons has given up its power to control the conduct of its own MPs. And it's given that power to an organisation called the Independent Complaints and Grievance Service. And that means that now members of Parliament can find themselves ousted, not because they've offended against the Representation of the People Act, which specifies that if you are sentenced to imprisonment for more than 6 months, then you forfeit your right to be an MP, as you would do also if you were bankrupt. What we've now got is a situation where members of Parliament may be the subject of rather dubious complaints, which are then investigated in private by appointed officials, unaccountable, and then those officials reach a conclusion on the innocence or guilt of the Member of Parliament concerned. That report is then transferred to the Standards Committee with a recommendation for a penalty. That penalty cannot be changed by Parliament. Parliament can only endorse it or completely reject it. And what I'm describing is the most recent example is of Peter Bone, MP for Wellingborough, one of the Spartans to whom we've had reference earlier, who was, I say this openly, I think has been the victim of a really serious miscarriage of justice. And he is now facing a recall petition in his constituency because of the recall of MPs legislation 2015, which I actually voted against and spoke against when I was a member of the Constitutional Affairs Committee. And talk about the law of unintended consequences. At the time, people said, oh, well, that's never going to really make much difference. It's only going to be the most egregious cases which will ever trigger that mechanism. But now we've got, Peter has been suspended for 6 weeks. Any suspension in excess of 10 days results in the opportunity for the constituents of a member to vote in a referendum for recall. And the people are spoon-fed in that respect. You can't, as a sitting member of Parliament, campaign against the recall. All you can do is watch the setting up over, I think, a 6-week period of polling stations in your constituency where people are invited to come in and just tick the box for wanting recall. And if you are somebody who's got a postal vote, you actually have the postal vote sent to you. So with a reply-paid envelope enabling you to trigger this recall. So it's hardly surprising that the recall petition is likely to be carried because it only requires to support it. But Peter Bone has never been convicted of a criminal offence. He's never faced any criminal charges. All that he's said is that some person who is anonymous made a complaint against him which dates back about 10 years, and that a person who was unaccountable investigated this and decided that Peter was guilty. This is a complete undermining of our parliamentary democracy. If somebody is dissatisfied with the conduct of their MP, then they have the opportunity at a forthcoming election to vote accordingly. And yet that's the message from the Representation of the People Act. And isn't it sinister that we now find that our elected House of Commons has ceded this power, never to be recovered, I suspect, to unelected bodies. And Parliament has also surrendered and continues to surrender much of its law-making power. How does it do that? Because it's passing legislation in the broadest terms and leaving all the detail to be filled in by statutory instruments. And statutory instruments are not subject to proper scrutiny. It's impossible for, most of them are not discussed in Parliament at all. The ones that are can't be amended. And who drafts the statutory instruments? They're not drafted under the control of ministers, the subject of any scrutiny. They are drafted by officialdom. They are drafted by the administrative branch. And that means that, for example, to take most recently the legislation to deal with control of the internet, that most of that legislation has been passed, but it's in very broad terms, and it will be statutory instrument detail and guidance thereon issued by officials, which will determine what happens. And what has also happened is that the Quango state has developed exponentially. The last count, I think, there were something like 250 Quangos. But those Quangos are not even accountable properly to ministers. And to give you a current example from my own constituency, we have had an organisation called Natural England has imposed a complete ban on house building in Christchurch, which means that sites in the centre of the town, including on the former gasworks and another site on the former police station site, those cannot be developed. Why can't they be developed? Because Natural England says that were they to be developed, there would be an addition to the phosphate excess which was already prevalent in the catchment area of the River Avon, and that is a catchment area which is actually tidal. So, Natural England says that there are already so many phosphates in that part of the River Avon that there must be, we can't add any more, even though it would be a very small amount. But yet it is impossible to reduce that level of phosphates because most of the phosphates emanate from the 50 miles upstream from Christchurch. So the other day I was at a meeting with Tony Juniper, whom you may know is the boss of Natural England, and I asked him about this. And he was extremely coy and said that he'd given advice to the department on what could be done. And I said, well, what is that advice? And he said, I can't tell you. It's internal. And that's the situation where we've got somebody like Tony Juniper and his gang are basically preventing housing being built in my constituency, with possibly the perverse result that the only housing that will be able to be developed is going to be on greenfield sites rather than on the brown land which we support. Another example of an unelected agency is the Environment Agency, which has decreed that the Avon Valley path, which crosses from the one side of my constituency to another across the River Avon, and that path has been in existence as a national footpath, but it obviously is vulnerable because it's on a causeway. That causeway is being eroded by flooding. The landowner wishes to reinforce that causeway, and the Environment Agency has said, no, you can't. We want to have that as a floodplain without any causeway there. So effectively the Environment Agency is interfering to prevent a long-established footpath being maintained. And to whom is the Environment Agency accountable? Yeah. No, it is not accountable to anybody. And if you ask questions in Parliament, those questions have to be through the ministers, and the ministers themselves don't have any control over these quangos. And we then have a situation where ministers themselves have put forward legislation which it further deprives ministers of the opportunity to take control. For example, the climate change legislation, the net zero legislation, it was all given to an unelected quango, the climate change committee, to decide what's done. And so the government then finds that it's in court because somebody says that the plan to allowing Heathrow to have an extra runway might offend against the wishes of the unelected climate change committee. And so it goes on. And the government and parliament are giving all this power to these unelected administrators. So that's why I think we really need to be alert to the threat that there is in of the rise of the administrative state, which is pushing members of parliament into a position where they're marginalised, when their scope for being able to hold the government to account is significantly inhibited. And this is not just happening in this country, it's happening in other countries as well. But it was given a big boost by what happened during the COVID pandemic, which was a green light to all those people who are innately wanting to take control of other people's lives, interfere in other people's lives, take away the independence from people. That appetite for power was really developed in that period of the COVID pandemic. And we're now seeing another part of the state, the judges, in the form of the Lady Hallett running the inquiry. We're seeing a complete travesty of what should be the key issues in relation to the COVID inquiry. Why did we ever lock down? Was it necessary? All those statements that were made about the vaccines being safe and effective, were they really safe and effective? Why did we prevent people going around about their lawful business? Why did we prevent people being able to go and see their loved ones in hospitals or nursing homes? And all those restrictions upon the liberty of the individual. Is Mrs. Lady Hallett getting on with that? No, I don't think she is. And if you wanted a vivid example of the double standards applying, you may have been aware that Patrick Vallance gave evidence to the inquiry, I think in the last 10 days or so. And he was the person who was saying how the Prime Minister had been bamboozled by the scientific evidence. And yet it was Patrick Vallance himself who was called to account by the National Statistics Authority for having put up a false information in terms of graphs. So he himself was guilty of trying to bamboozle the public with graphs. I expected that the counsel to the inquiry, or even the judge herself, would say to Sir Patrick, well, hang on a minute, weren't you in the business of bamboozling rather than being bamboozled? But not a bit of it. And if you want a vivid example of those double standards, I think that is a good one to recall. So it's quite a dry subject, the rise of the administrative state. Some people talk about it as the rise of the nanny state. But the other side of that coin is it's the erosion of our democracy and our democratic freedoms. And having had the privilege of being an elected representative of the people for the best part of 40 years, Peter and I were celebrating 40 years since we were first elected as a party, not long ago, in June this year. Not enough of my colleagues understand the threat or are speaking out against it. So it's been a great pleasure to be able to use the platform of the Bruges Group to reinforce my concerns.